Welcome to the Gauntlet Podcast, our GM Masterclass episode. My name is Kate.
And I'm Jason.
Thanks for joining me again, Jason, in one of our still kind of wankery episodes about being good GMs.
Yes. I love being a master of games. Can I just say that? Like how pleasing it is to me.
Cringe. This time you're actually going to ask the first question, right? You came up with something for the two of us to talk about?
Well, we should mention that this is going to be the behind the scenes episode. We're talking about topics related to behind the scenes GMing, right?
Yes, we totally are. Kind of what goes on before you sit down at the table.
Exactly. So my question in that spirit for you, and indeed for me, is you have 1 hour to prepare your session. What do you do?
Wonder how I got into that situation, first of all.
Yeah, that's that now, right?
So it depends, right? It depends on if this is a one-shot or if this is a campaign game, if I've left my prep to the last minute. Generally what I do is I will write down like 3 things I think are important that are going to happen. So if this is Urban Shadows, I write down like there's a Fae party where one court is totally going to be extinguished. There's an attempt to make the werewolves submit by someone, probably not in Night Faction. And some human YouTuber is like getting evidence of the supernatural and posting it on YouTube.
Nice.
And then every time someone rolls, I'll infuse a bit of that into their answers that they get from a roll until I figure out what sticks, what they're interested in, and then I let the other ones die as is appropriate.
Nice. That's good. So you kind of like, you come with just some big ticket kind of like hooks, basically.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, if it's a campaign play and this is an ongoing story, I will choose 2 of the players I know are going to be there, and I will write consequences for whatever they did last episode and make them kind of the focal points of this episode. So it feels like I've totally prepared and I thought about this and I've got all my things, when it's just like, you fucked this up last episode. It's coming back.
Right. Yeah, that's good.
What about you? What do you do?
Yeah, when I was thinking about the answer to this after I posed the question, and I should mention that I actually got this question from one of your question calls too. I just liked it. I was like, oh, that's a good question. I was thinking about it in terms of like, well, depending on who the audience I'm prepping the session for is, right? So, for example, first of all, if it's your ongoing campaign and you need more than an hour to prepare, you're probably doing it wrong. So we'll just put a pin in that for now.
Shots fired.
No, seriously, I think once you get into the groove of like intercession stuff, I can't imagine needing more than an hour to like get the next stuff going, but whatever. The more interesting situation, I think, is the sort of spontaneous gaming event, right? The emergency gaming situation.
Is that a thing in your daily life?
I mean, it happens, right? I mean, friends randomly stopping by, or someone says, hey, let's play a role-playing game, or you're with a group of non-role players and they know you're into role-playing games and they say, why don't we play one of your little story things, right?
This never happens to me. You live in such a mysterious world.
Oh, God. When I lived in Houston, this happened to me all the time.
Really?
So, yeah. So here's the answer, right? You have a few trusty games that you can pull out and run at a moment's notice. For me, it's games like The Final Girl, Cheat Your Own Adventure, Kaleidoscope, pretty much anything that doesn't require you to have to print character sheets, right? Mm-hmm. I actually have a box that I refer to as Mother's Ashes, and there's a whole story behind that, but I'm not going to go into it now. But this box contains all of the little tools you need to run like any number of games on the fly, right? Index cards, markers, poker chips, playing cards, that kind of thing, right?
Yeah, we have that at cons, actually.
Yeah, it's a great thing. I keep mine in my car because, you just never know when a gaming emergency is going to break out, right? Make a habit of putting all of your game PDFs on your phone. That way you have the rules handy, right? I think that's a great move. If it's a situation where you do have the ability to go print out some character sheets and you're comfortable running a particular game, like say for me, it's like Monster of the Week or Dungeon World, right? I have one-shot scenarios kind of ready to go always for DW and Monster of the Week. And so that's another thing too, like kind of just have your little, kind of put that in your toolbox, right? Like a game you really love, a game that you think like shows off role-playing well, and you could kind of do in a one-shot. The other situation, probably
I'm
the more...
sorry, you're blowing my mind here. Like, this is a concern for your life, that you have, like, an emergency kit I would only take to a con in your car.
Oh my, no, oh gosh, no, I am ready. I don't get ready, I stay ready.
Can you move to Canada now?
No, seriously, I mean, I'm a full service GM. Let's just put it that way, okay?
All right.
Or not. The other situation, let me just move on. The other situation is more common for me, actually. It's you've had 2 months to prep a game because it's been on the calendar for 2 months and you waited until you had 1 hour left. What do? This is actually pretty straightforward. If you haven't had time to read the whole book, if it's a new game you're playing, for example, just read the character creation and session 0 type stuff and make sure you have a really, really good session 0, right? Focus on world building, focus on character creation. Players love that kind of stuff anyway. And if you do want to do a little bit of role play, just kind of follow the characters around for a little bit after you're done.
Yeah, no, that's fair. I don't think it's necessarily fair to say if you take longer than an hour to prep for a campaign, you're doing it wrong. I think that's
I know. I'm kidding. I'm totally kidding.
Indie way to do things.
No, it really is.
I know I used to prep for Trail of Cthulhu, and it would take me an hour and a half usually because I was learning all the things so that I could look like I knew what I was doing. When I had only an hour to prep, like I had a few minutes before game, I would try to skim through and pick 2 to 3 things I thought were really, really interesting and more likely to be attractive to my players, and I would essentially just erase the rest and be like, these are the only things that exist now.
Nice.
Yeah. So cutting and pasting, I think if you're running more Tread or OSRE games, is easier for that 1 hour prep where you're like, these are the things we're focusing on.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, and also an hour is actually a pretty decent amount of time. I know we just said like, oh, I was just kidding about like, oh, why do you need more than an hour? But it actually is a pretty good amount of time. I mean, you can come up with like 2 solid encounters in an hour, right? And 2 solid encounters will lead to other things that you don't need to prep at all. It'll just happen at the table, right? So it's more time than you think.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. The other thing I would recommend is people who struggle with it a little, maybe check out a book called Play Unsafe. I read it years ago, and it's like an improv book. So check that book out. It is actually quite helpful, and it helps me, like 8 years ago, become the GM I am today, which is...
It's very good, yeah.
Yeah, cool. Moving on to our community questions. So from Joshua Hellerup on the G+ community, this is a bit of a long question, so bear with me. I like having games that aren't one-shots, but I have found it basically impossible to have exactly the same group of people to show up for every session. And cancellations almost always happen in between sessions instead of something that can be planned for at one session for the next. Is there any techniques that help ongoing play when it's unpredictable who will show up?
Well, this is a great question. My sense is that a lot of groups consider this to be a much bigger deal than it really is. I mean, you and I know it's not a really huge deal, that there are ways to deal with it. But my sense is a lot of groups, like to the point of like letting their game fall apart, right? When there's inconsistent players. Don't do that. There are ways to handle this.
Do you want to start us off with your ideas, Jason?
Yeah, I'll kick us off. Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. I think sort of big picture, maybe when you're in the planning phases of your campaign, try making your campaign a little more episodic in nature. So I really like Monster of the Week and Blades in the Dark and games like that because they have, their structure has like natural endpoints, I guess. Like in Monster of the Week, for example, you are supposed to prepare a mystery that lasts a session or possibly 2 sessions, but generally 1 session. And it's a completely self-contained mystery. It's episodic, meaning if player A, B, C, and D are there for that one, but only players A, B, and C are there for the next one, it doesn't really affect things too much. Does that make sense?
Yeah, for sure. I like episodic just because I think television shows nail how to handle this. Because how often are you watching something and one actor isn't there because they're off filming something else? My favorite example of this is, I think it's in the episode Out of Gas in Firefly when Zoe is knocked out for the whole episode and they just do flashbacks. That, yeah. It's a great episode, right? But just pretend that your characters are actors who are filming something else and come up with a convenient reason for them not to be there. They'll survive. It's okay.
Yeah, it's not the end of the world. And especially if you're doing it episodic in an episodic way where that sort of like beat by beat, scene by scene continuity, unbroken is not really kind of what's going on. Therefore, it's not, not a huge deal. You don't have to worry about that. When I run fantasy games, I have this structure for organizing some fantasy series and campaigns that I run called songs. So I've done Songs of the Yellow City. I'm currently doing Songs of the Shadow Court. I've done Songs of Belet Osk and things like that. And when I say songs, it always means we are telling little compartmentalized stories, sometimes with the same group of people, sometimes with mixed groups, but it's always in the same world. There's a basic through line between all of them. But for this session, we are doing this particular little self-contained story. And it just really helps facilitate and create a space where you can have the people moving back and forth, between sessions. It's not like damaging to the overall campaign if you have people going in and out. At the Gauntlet, we're very, very good at open table play, right? This is something we do a lot of, and this is just kind of born out of that. I think Joshua's question, though, is probably more about like the traditional long-term campaign where it's just a single story, right? I think that's probably the harder question, but definitely something we should talk about.
Yeah, so I have a couple things I do for that. One is I actually over-recruit for my games. These are meat space games I'm kind of talking about, though, to be fair, where if I need 4 players, I will have 5 or 6, because I know consistently about 3 to 4 people are going to show up. Everyone else is going to kind of fade in and out. So I have too many players, and once in a while it makes for a really stressful game where all 6 manage to appear. But those are busy games, and those are those epic scenes where you have big fights and stuff, because there's all 6 of them, right? So do the cool thing with all 6 characters. The other thing I do is I try to divide the story between myself and my players in these situations where I'm like, what is it you want to do this episode, and how do you plan to make that happen? So when we get to the table, they're already doing all of this thing. They're already bringing their own story. So when we're missing a character, that's okay. We have set 5 other stories to go through. It's cool.
Yeah, I like that a lot. For me, I'm a big fan of the Apocalypse World style love letter, or the Apocalypse World, love letter concept that Vincent came up with. A love letter in Apocalypse World, and indeed in other Powered by the Apocalypse games, is... Okay, so you have a player who's missing one session. They come back for the next session, and you have written a little short, almost like a little summary of what their character might have been up to, or what they were up to, and maybe even have a little custom move that's appended to it that you kind of roll to kind of see how their little side thing went. That's kind of what their character was doing while they were gone. I love the love letter, and I use it a lot. I lean on love letters to really... to kind of make that missing character, when they come back, feel like they were still doing something, or that player, when they come back, to make it feel like their character was still doing something in the story. And once you get in the habit of using love letters, you can actually really leverage them to your own advantage. For example, you can have the missing character, maybe they were exploring an important part of the dungeon or an important part of the adventure that the party glossed over or skipped, but you kind of needed them to see it, right? Maybe they encounter something important that's coming up, and you want to kind of, use their experience that they were doing off, to the side, to sort of telegraph that bad thing is coming up. You can have the missing character observe something in another part of the world. Maybe they went off to go do this thing over here, and they saw something bad happening in another part of the world. You're kind of just advancing your fronts or whatever, right? That, I think you can turn what appears to be a compromise or a liability into something that works for your story.
Yeah, when I do love letters for that reason, it's usually, you've been off doing something horrible. It's never a nice thing. It's no, you were in Monster Hearts and you were off being a douche to somebody, and you come back, and how do you feel about that, and how are you going to make it up to this person? So that it's more drama focused, because that's how I play. The other thing I think is really important to note, that your fiction should never be solely dependent on one player. That's
very true, yeah.
Yeah, you should know your world and your players and your NPCs well enough that if the fiction is dependent on one person showing up, you've made that game about them, and that's not fun for everybody.
I'm glad you bring that up, because honestly, that's why The Chosen was so terrible.
Yeah.
See my rhetorical trap I just laid for you there, Kate.
Yeah.
Listeners, Kate loves The Chosen and wishes it wasn't gone in Monster Hearts 2.
The Chosen is only terrible if you play it shittily.
Well, that seems like a truism if I've ever heard one before. No, I'm mostly kidding. No, I think you're right. I mean, yeah, that's a big danger for one thing, that's not even good for the other players. Like, how alienating for the story to be about one character and not theirs, right?
No, I think you make a good point with The Chosen, though, because that's what it is written to do. And one of the challenges of, like, if you like that archetype, it's the same thing with the Hunter, to be honest, in Urban Shadows, is you need to, like, read that and figure out, how do I make this not about me?
Yeah.
Challenge yourself as a player. Be a good player. Make it not about you.
Probably a different topic.
Yeah, so the one thing I was going to say, like, if you don't find out until you're at game and someone texts you and they're like, oh, I can't make it. You're like, oh shit, now what do I do? Start in media res. It's the easiest thing to do. Start in the middle of conflict and ask them, so why isn't this person here and how did you fuck that up?
Yeah, that's good. What about the situation, Kate, where you ended the previous session on a cliffhanger and everyone was clearly there at the moment of the cliffhanger, and then when you come back for the resolution of the cliffhanger, no one is there, or someone's missing, right? Maybe you're missing one or two people. What would you do in that situation?
That happens a lot in Monster Hearts.
Yeah, it's a major Monster Hearts problem. Yeah, you're right.
I jump forward in time, and we reveal what happened in play by asking pointed questions. Right? So, like, if if you're having the ghoul do something, you're like, okay, what about this moment reminds you of the outcome of that last cliffhanger? And they give you a tidbit, and you ask everyone tidbits until this picture has been painted where you finally reveal what happened at the end of the episode.
Yeah, I think that's great. And that's actually kind of a love letter, right? In some ways. I mean, essentially, you're sort of summarizing some fiction. And would you put like a move on that too, or have some kind of die roll involved?
Statistically, I feel like that's going to happen at game. Like, I feel like that's the moment where you're sitting there and someone's like, oh shit, I can't come. So no, I wouldn't. Unless I would be like, I need a 5-minute break to go write a custom move.
To go write a custom move break.
2 seconds, loves. But I think that would be a good way to facilitate it. I think that's a smarter way to do it than my way of just being like, I'm going to ask a provocative question.
Well, no, I mean, I think either works fine depending on what your circumstances are, for sure. You know, one thing I want to point out here too, you know, we've been kind of talking about love letter and love letter type devices for sort of catching up players and figuring out what their characters were up to and summarizing things. And so you kind of move ahead in a way that makes sense. One thing I think is worth pointing out is this works in trad games too, right? You can do very similar things in OSR or trad games. You can even attach a couple of like, you know, die rolls to it to kind of see how certain things, you know, how the outcome might have gone. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that, right? It's not going to break it.
I actually find this is actually an easier problem in trad games because it's so much easier to say, like, you got kidnapped by the bad guys.
Right, yeah.
I find it such an easier excuse when you're in a dungeon to be like, oh no, this person totally just disappeared through a wall. What are you guys going to do about it?
That's true. Yeah, that's fair. Like the sort of the conceits of the dungeon, or the sort of
right?
That's actually pretty good. But
I feel like the fiction gives you more space than it does when you're like, I don't know, playing Cartel and you're like, oh, a person's not here who's like El Narco.
Or you and Levi the werewolf are having an argument, and then, you know,
right?
What happens next, right?
Yeah. So I find the more there's less emotional space in it, the more it's just about like doing cool shit, the easier it is to be like, well, here's a cool thing that's happening to them that's off screen.
Yep. In summary, I mean, don't let this break up your campaign. Like, whatever you do, there is a way to fix it. There's a way to make it better. There's a way to make it work for you. Yeah, I see this a lot, and I'm always like, oh man, but you could have done this, or you could have done that.
Yeah, and make your players take ownership of that. Don't make it all up to you.
Yeah, yep, very good point.
Our next question is from Kyle Simons on G+. What do you do to maintain hype and interest between you and the players between game sessions?
I am a proud citizen of Validation Nation. That is my methodology. I dispense validation and positive reinforcement at every turn, and at lots of different levels. Among the play group itself, especially during debrief, debrief is a great time to just give little attaboys and shout outs and attagirls to the players. That's a great thing to do. Among your wider community, it's easy for us in the Gauntlet because we have a place where we all congregate and we can kind of do little shout outs. But even just like your Facebook, friends or whatever, right? You can do it there too. Just say like, hey, I'm so excited about this game I played. Such and such did this awesome thing, right? At the individual level, I do little like check-ins. I'll sometimes slide into someone's, direct messages and say, hey, I was just thinking about your character from the other day and I really liked when you did XYZ. I think that's how I keep people excited, by making them feel awesome. So
you are super into like dreams for everybody.
Yeah, dreams for everyone, right? I'm so into just positive reinforcement. It's my thing. So
I dig it. It's great. I do things very differently. I mean, I still validate people because that's just like my modus operandi. But we tend to use Facebook groups because I live on Facebook, as everybody knows. So we make a Facebook group for our game, and you post your cool character pictures and your theme songs for that episode. And then we'll post it's so fun. And we post like AMA threads where it's like, ask my character anything.
Wow.
No, it's so good. To the point where like Rach and I, plus one forward, we have two characters that have been together forever. And when we're having a bad day, we're like, character questions, Rach.
Wow, this is amazing.
It makes me so happy.
So we spend so much time discovering, the questions will just be like, what is your character's favorite fruit? And why? And for some reason...
Great. I love it. That's good.
It gives you such weird nuances to your character so that when you're out and someone's like, oh, what are your characters eating? You're like, well, I know she doesn't like bananas.
And everyone else is like, what?
Right. So we do that. If it's just on my end to keep myself hype, I make little NPC documents where I keep track of their debts and strings and their drives, and I update all that information. And I'm like, oh shit, that's right. This person now hates this person, and that's going to like really fuck with them next episode. So I get myself excited by plotting how mean I'm going to be.
I love that. I think that's really great. What you said about like creating Facebook groups where you create playlists and things like that. What you're really doing is you're kind of developing like the canon of your world, right? You're creating like your campaign world's mythology, so to speak. And that actually really resonates with me. I don't do that particular thing, but that resonates with me a lot because what I do is I focus a lot in my longer term campaigns on the sort of meta plot or like the mythology of the world, like I'm really into that, and my players are too. And so we spend a lot of time talking about like, what does this mean? What does that mean? Right? Like trying to connect the dots and all that kind of stuff. So, I think I think creating a sort of like campaign mythology, a canon, is really a great thing to do.
Yeah, it's been the only thing I've really struggled with playing with the Gauntlet is that you don't have that kind of space where we can post stuff that lives there forever. So I can go back to campaigns I had 4 years ago and be like, oh my God, look at this stupid character.
It's a super interesting idea. It makes me wonder if we could do something like that because, like someone who we play a lot with is Lauren McManaman, who's one of the editors on Codex. And she does that, right? She creates playlists for her characters and she does, she does image boards. Garrett does that. He makes like these collage image boards of just things inspired by the session, right? Like just, we should probably collect that stuff somewhere. That's a good.
We should figure out how to do that as an aside for more work for us.
Right, exactly. Right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And the other thing we do is we do a Facebook chat with the whole group in it. So you're constantly kind of like talking to each other and keeping tabs and everything. And we all try to choose like faces for our characters that are in television shows so we can send gifts to each other of our characters.
Oh my God, you guys are out of control.
It's the best, Jason. It is the best.
I feel good about that one. That's a good question.
We're hype about our hype.
Yeah.
All right, cool. So our next question from Misha Krylov on G+. How can a person get decent critique of their GMing?
I had a really hard time with this one. This is a hard question. I had a hard time with it because I practice a very active sort of self-awareness of my GMing. when something doesn't work, I know it and I don't need anyone to tell me. Right? Like, I'm really keenly aware of when things aren't working. A lot of people do roses and thorns. I think you do. I'll let you explain it a little bit more, but whenever you answer, but like, for me, roses and thorns, I've never been a huge fan, mostly because if it was a good session, to me, I feel like thorns kind of dampens the energy a little bit. And then if it was a bad or lame session, for me, it just feels like beating a dead horse, So that's kind of like, that's just my personal feeling about roses and thorns. That said, I do like to consider, I sometimes sit and I think about the whole session, kind of what happened. And if I do have a question about something that I did or something I tried, I usually just kind of like, I just ping like a trusted player and just see what they thought.
So how did you become so self-aware while jamming?
That's a great question. It's a combination of having done it a lot. And I have like really simple measures for how I'm doing. One is I pay close attention to everyone's faces. And when you play principally online, that's easy to do because you can see everyone's faces all at once. And so whenever you unfurl some, great moment, some awesome NPC, I can tell how they're reacting, right? Like I can see it. I know how it's playing. I have in the past watched videos of myself and I've gotten like, where if I thought I did something really well, I sometimes will watch the video back just to see if I can figure out precisely why I thought it went well, or if I feel uncomfortable about a thing, I can go back and watch it. So that's a thing I've done, but mostly it just comes from like living and breathing this culture of GMing, right? And I think that's maybe not something that a lot of people have access to, but so it's kind of a personal thing. I'm not sure that like my experience is easily transposable to other people. Not sure.
Yeah, I think there's a difficulty level for people who aren't GMing as often as you or as often even as I do, especially people who maybe aren't neurotypical or people who have a harder time reading body language and facial expressions and tone and intonation.
Yeah.
So generally what I like, roses and thorns is a thing. So if you're not familiar with that, roses are where you ask for your positive feedback. What were the beautiful things about this game? And thorns are what are the things that made you bleed, and not in a happy, like emotional bleed way, but in a that's kind of sucked way. Recently on the Gauntlet, I've seen this switching to stars and wishes, I think is what it's called.
Yeah. Is that Sydney's thing?
I don't. Maria did it with me when we were playing Urban Shadows.
Yeah.
And
I've seen this too. You might want to explain it though, unpack what it is.
So it's the softer, sweeter way of doing roses and thorns. Essentially,
it's a very Gauntlet way of doing it, of course.
It is. I saw it and I was like, oh, only the Gauntlet. So stars are like things that you really liked and you want to look more at, and wishes are things you wish happened more because it didn't happen. Or
it's just roses and thorns, but like touchy-feely roses and thorns.
It's sweet. It's not saying like this sucked. It's saying this is what I wish would happen. Like it's changing intention, essentially.
I think that's right. I think there is something intrinsically negative about thorns, right?
Yeah,
like,
it is.
I think it like
right?
it definitely like kind of puts your thumb on the scale of what kind of talk you're about to have, at least in my opinion. But I know Lowell and Rich. I know they used roses and thorns to great effect. Lowell's very active practitioner of it, and I like that. But another thing for me is I often don't want to hear how it went right after sometimes, right? Like I said this before in one of the other episodes, the other Masterclass episodes, I sometimes let the players do their debrief for a while before I even join in, because I like to have some space from the session sometimes to think about what I want to think about, And so I let the debrief kind of focus on just their feelings about things, right? As opposed to like, what did I do good? What did I do bad? Technique and blah.
Yeah, I think that's important to note that sometimes when people are debriefing after an episode, they're not actually talking about the mechanization of the game as you would see it as the GM. They're talking about how they felt about what happened to their characters. And that's a different emotional response than I didn't like that you did this one thing with this hard move, right? Like that's two separate, unless you get into conversations like you deprotagonized me and other really lingo.
Yeah. Whenever somebody pulls out whenever someone pulls out an I felt deprotagonized, I'm always like, oh hell. Here we go.
You're one of those. Yeah, so the things I found really helpful for me when I was struggling to become a better, I would say, Powered by the Apocalypse GM, moving from trad over to indie, was I would actually game with people who I thought I wanted to GM like them, and I would play a lot with them, and then I would cannibalize what I thought was the essence of their GMing and try to do that. And I borrowed their techniques, and I listened to how they talk to people, and I listened to how they ask questions, and I took it. I just absorbed it like a little sponge.
That's actually really great advice. This comes up on our Slack a lot. They'll ask a question about, say, running Dungeon World, right? Because we have a lot of Dungeon World players, and I'm known to be a Dungeon World GM. And I sometimes just chime in and say, go listen to We Hunt the Keepers. That's one of our podcasts. Go listen to We Hunt the Keepers. I made it for you, right? Like I made it for you to absorb and steal from, and or not steal. It's given freely to take from, right?
Yeah. So usually if people approach me, often in the face-to-face world, they're like, "I love how you GM. How do you do that?" I'm like, "Come play a game with me, and you have carte blanche to interrupt me and ask questions."
Oh, that's interesting. Now that's something I'm not sure how I feel about.
Well, everyone knows what the session is then, right? Like everyone's bought in.
That's fair. Yeah. If you set the expectation, I guess it's okay. Yeah.
Yeah. So I do that. The other thing I've done to get better at running actually my own games is every time I've gone to a session where I'm playtesting, I'll record it, or we have the great benefit in the Gauntlet of people recording things, and you can just watch. You can watch when you falter, when you hesitate, how people are receiving what your words are. Because you're so emotional in the space of GMing that sometimes it's hard to like step back and see that people are going quiet, or see that people are into it even though you thought they weren't, or not into it when you thought they were. So listen and watch yourself.
Yeah, I think that's great advice.
Keeping in mind, GMing is a performance, and performers watch themselves perform in the mirror.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's right. And for me, another thing I would say to keep in mind, this is just sort of a cosmic philosophical thing or something. At a certain point, understand when to reject the critique. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Because there are some people who are maybe just not a good fit for your style, right? And I've had that happen in my GMing, right? Where it's just a particular player, we just don't gel. And I had to, make a decision of like, hey, you know what? I'm too busy focusing on the people who love me to worry about the one person who is not happy, right? Like, and at a certain point, you have to just face it, right? Just kind of cut it loose.
Yeah, it's important not to internalize everything you get as feedback. I write it all down and then go back to it later when I'm ready to read it and decide what's valid and what's just like, I don't care.
Yeah, this actually comes up quite a bit on our Slack. I will have conversations. People ping me all the time in direct message, which you're welcome to do, Slackers. I love that. But people ping me all the time like, hey, I'm getting ready to run this session. I watched your video of XYZ, and I just had a couple of questions. And then they'll say something like, I've been getting this kind of feedback during my Roses and Thorns. What do you think about that? Or I don't know. I'm trying to be better about that. And sometimes what they say doesn't always sound like a super legit critique. It's like, and I'm like, maybe you should not worry about that particular bit of feedback. I think you're probably doing okay.
Yeah. Yeah. If your players are kind of at odds with you, then it's probably time to find a new set of players.
Yeah. Just be willing to say, hey, you know what? It's not working. Because honestly, you'll know, right? You'll know, like the people who love what you're doing, you'll know, and the people who are not into it, you'll eventually figure out we're just not a good fit. And I think you have to be able to face that at some point.
It's true. Yeah. The only other thing I've done sometimes, and I've really been struggling with a game, is I've invited people I really trust, like a lot of really close friends who are GMs that I trust and I enjoy their games. And I'm like, can you come play this game with me and just like see where my weaknesses are and tell me what you think?
Yeah. That's a hard question though, man. Really hard.
Yeah. Well done with that one. We had to really sit here and be like,
Yeah, I pondered it for a long time. It's a tough question.
Do you want to do the last question?
Sure. So this came from our Slack. This was from Matthias. And Matthias asks, the last time it was mentioned, I think by you, Kate, that your players constantly want to go talk to your NPCs. How do you get the players to be that keen on and interested in your NPCs? I love this question because I think you and I have different answers on it. But why don't you start?
I felt weird answering this because I feel like I've blogged about this, and I'm always worried that if I blog about something and then talk about something on a podcast, I'm doubling up on, like, I don't know, my advice.
Don't worry about it. How many times have I said setting expectations or the tone conversation? 900 times. Trust me, you can't say it enough.
Fair. Fair. So I try to make my NPCs like, people. So I give them flaws and emotions and things in the world they're invested in, and I make them invested in the PCs. Because when you're running around talking to people as a human being and just not even engaged as people, the person you're going to go talk to again is the person that made you feel like you have a connection. So give your NPCs connections to the PCs and make them seem genuine, right? Like they genuinely want to be your friend, or they genuinely want to stop you from doing something because they think you're hurting yourself. Like, give them emotions.
I like that a lot. Just to piggyback off that a bit, a really great thing you can do to really deepen and enrich that connection between the NPC and the PC in a hurry is to ask a loaded question to the player about that NPC, right?
Yes. One of my favorite things to do, and I took this from a provocative list of questions for Monster Hearts, but one of the questions is, and you ask every player this question, is, what's so hot about the guy with the blue hair?
Yes.
Right? And everyone answers it regardless of how straight they are and dude-like. They answer that question. And suddenly you have this really loaded character that you can just walk around with and being like, oh yeah, remember that guy with the blue hair you think's really hot? Yeah, he's totally approaching you.
I love the sort of like question that implies that they have a past. Something like, hey, the last time you ran into NPC X, you were at a really low moment. How did they help you get out of it?
Oh, that's so good.
Yeah, just stuff really like that. Good. And you get to the emotional, you sort of raise the emotional stakes like right away. Right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a smart way to do it. Yeah. I just do it by being personable.
Yeah. I mean, well, so that's actually a pretty good segue into what I want to say, which is I'm a performative GM. And I think that one of the best ways you can make your NPCs super compelling and engaging is if you characterize them really strongly, right? And I think making them personable is part of that, right? It's the 3-1 part of 7-3-1 that I talked about, I think last episode or the episode before. A simple thing you can do for characterization is give the NPC 3 sensory details that help you paint a picture in the mind of the player, right? That's step 1. And then step 2 is figure out a way to embody them at the table. It can be just one simple thing. This is advice that came from the Jankcast, and I love it. It can be a nervous tic. It can be a particular way of speaking. It can be an accent or a voice. It can be your body posture, right? Just something that you do consistently whenever that character is on screen. It really, really magnifies the realism and the sort of presence of the NPC. And I think that's a big, big part of it. I have an NPC named Jacqueline Weir. She is a character in Mercy Falls, my Monster Hearts campaign, my long-running Monster Hearts campaign. And I always describe her, no matter what her situation is, I always include these details. She wears a slim-fitting women's separates suit and a strand of pearls, and she's smoking a cigarette. I always, always, always include those details. No matter where they're at, she always lights up a cigarette. And it's just like little things like that that help make the NPC feel more real, Yeah, so I think strong characterization is a big part of it.
I agree. And part of that is engaging with people how they would engage with people and watching how you talk as them. So I don't do accents for 1, I can't do them, and 2, because a lot of people do kind of offensive accents.
Often they're very offensive. Yeah, I consider a voice to be different from an accent. Yeah.
Yes. So the way some people will talk is different, though the language they use. I will ensure there's at least one NPC per game I'm running who's sassy and gives you a cute nickname and is always a little bit in your personal space.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, right. And immediately you can know I'm being her because of how she talks and what she calls you.
I love that. Yeah.
So nicknames are powerful that way. So giving people nicknames, it's really, really good.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, just any easily recognizable thing you can embody at the table or that you can express routinely about that NPC, that just goes a really, really long way. And it doesn't have to be a big over the top characterization, right? Not every NPC has to be big man. And a lot of Gauntlet people know who I'm talking about. Not every, they don't have to be so big or so over the top. It can just be a little thing. One other thing that I think is really helpful, I have not lately, I say lately, it's been for like years. I basically cast my NPCs from like a TV show. So my favorites lately are American Horror Story and Bates Motel, to the point where I have the same collection of pictures that I put on the image board for every like set of NPCs, right?
Did you know the reason why you can find GIFs of them now?
Oh, you mean like...
Yes, and send them? Like I do.
Oh, right.
Do
oh, yeah,
it's
yeah, exactly.
Best.
Yeah. I mean, my thing is like, I like American Horror Story for this reason. American Horror Story characters they're kind of one note, right? They're really one note. But that one noteness is a really powerful tool at the role-playing game table because you don't need much more to like portray an RPG NPC, right? You don't want them to be like, you want to be, like I said, it goes back to that sort of like easily identifiable characterization, right? American Horror Story characters tend to have big personality. They tend to be very kind of, they slot into a particular archetype. And it's an ensemble. There's a bunch of them, right? And so I do that. Like I imagine my various NPCs as the actors, in American Horror Story, or maybe an analog to the character they played or whatever, right? That's just something I've been doing for a long time. And I think it helps me kind of get into this space of how I want to portray the character.
Yeah. I think I go a little bit left of you because I tend to go more with every character here is fighting a war you can't see. So all of them have...
That's interesting.
Yeah, it's a policy I have in life is assume everybody that you meet is got problems and you can't see them. So be compassionate. What I do with NPCs is I take that very literally. So they're all involved in something that's messy and something that is impacted by the world, and they are impacting the world. So if you can impact the NPC as a player, it will impact the world, making your players feel like they have purpose.
Yeah, I like that. It's good.
Yeah, people make the world go round, right? Like people are what drive everything. So if your NPCs are just messengers of doom, like if they're just delivering information, they're not important, why would you ever want to engage with them?
Right. Right.
Yeah, so just make them important.
Yeah, this is all really great advice, and I really love how we definitely meet in certain areas, but we definitely have like a different approach in other areas, and I think a lot of it goes down to like our particular GM style too, right? Like my games, I occasionally get into like really emotional, sad feels territory, but not too often. My campaigns and my stories tend to be a little bit more camp. They tend to be a little bit more, they tend to have a certain like, I don't know, camp is the right word, I guess. Like they're just a little over the top. They're a little melodramatic sometimes, right? That's just kind of how I run games. And so, yeah, you can kind of see, whereas I know you run like much more like kind of emotionally intense games. And I think that makes a lot of sense the way you've described your approach.
Well, and yeah, because I can't do camp because I don't really have a sense of humor, so it makes it hard.
You just say that, but you don't mean it.
It's kind of true, though. There's always moments where people make jokes, and I'm like, no, why would you ever say that? That's horrible. And I was like, Kate, I'm joking. Like, I'm going to go over here. Yeah, so I don't allow that kind of shenanigans in my games.
I mean, I think there is, just to kind of circle back to Matthias's question, to some degree, it is a matter of style, right? But I think what we've identified here is really good stuff, characterization either through motivation and depth and, or characterization through the way you perform them.
Yep.
I think both are great approaches.
Yeah. So I guess in summary, make them cool. That's so helpful, right?
Why did we talk so long? We just said make them cool.
All right, cool. All right, let's move on to Giving Me Life.
Hi, listeners. I want to tell you about the newest issue of Codex, Codex Love 2. It's a sequel to the original Codex Love, and it has a lot of really fantastic features, including The Final Girl, a game of love, a hack of the classic horror movie game The Final Girl, but for reality dating shows like The Bachelor and Flavor of Love. And Then They Met, an original 2-player story game about a couple destined to fall in love, but that takes place entirely in the weeks and days leading up to the first time they lay eyes on each other. Willow Bluff, a queer-themed town for the classic game Dogs in the Vineyard. The newest Gauntlet Daddy, Sir Barrick, and his lovely companion Gwyn. 3 dozen men who need to be rescued. 7 original illustrations. And a custom layout by Ollie Jeffrey, whose work was recently seen in the smash hit Legacy 2E. To get Codex Love 2, just make a $4 or higher pledge on the Gauntlet Patreon by April 30th. That's at patreon.com/gauntlet. And don't forget, Codex back issues are now available on Drive-Thru RPG. Thanks.
It's Giving Me Life. I can't do the cool thing that you guys do with, like, the titles. I can't.
Is there a cool thing we do?
There was at the beginning of the Gauntlet when I was, like, listening to them back to back to back.
It's Giving Me Life or whatever, right?
See, I can't do it.
See what I'm talking about, though? Camp, right? See?
I guess I could be like, it's giving me life, like something emotionally intense.
That's pretty good. Yeah. Which that can be, but honestly, that's camp too, though, right? Like if you're saying it ironically, or if you're saying it in a way that's not meant to be taken seriously, that's camp.
All right, fine.
You just don't know it.
You win. What's giving you life?
There's a podcast I'm listening to right now. I'm only a couple episodes in. I hope it holds up, but it's called A Very Fatal Murder. It's produced by The Onion, and it was recommended to me by former co-host Dan. He was like, hey, you would love this. I'm like, okay. And it's really good. It's a parody of true crime podcasts like Serial and things like that. Very, very popular genre right now in podcasting, has been for a couple of years. And A Very Fatal Murder, it really leans into a lot of the tropes of the true crime podcast genre. They have like analogs to the common sorts of sponsors you hear on those podcasts, like Casper Mattress and HelloFresh and, stamps.com and all that, right? They have their own little versions of it. It's just, I wouldn't say it's like hilarious, but it's like so clever. And you're just like, oh God, you guys are too clever for the room. It's that kind of thing. But also it does this thing, which I think you would really appreciate, Kate. It does this thing where it always makes fun of the fact that a lot of podcasters, not just true crime podcasters, but a lot of podcasters think they are revealing something about the human condition or the white working class or whatever, or the yokels back in the, back home or whatever. Like they really like make fun of like this sort of like coastal lefty, like Ivy League grad podcaster who believes they're performing like very, very important, anthropological work by talking to people. So
wait, we're not doing important work?
Well, I consider us not podcasters of that ilk. I think we're a different kind of podcast. We're the kind of podcast that doesn't have stamps.com money coming in.
It's true. It's so true. Cool.
But A Very Fatal Murder, it's quite amusing. I'm not going to say hilarious, but it's amusing. So
I'll have to check it out because I'm kind of between podcasts right now.
Yeah, give it a listen and see. Yeah, they're pretty short.
So what's giving me life is people have heard recently I might have run a convention called Breakout, and for the first time ever, because it's only in its third year, we had like 70-something guests and 100-something volunteers, and it was about 220 to 250 in people I had to manage. And while I was printing badges and doing schedules and stuffing envelopes and bleeding from my cuticles from all the filing I was doing for it, I was watching the show called Nailed It.
Yes, I love Nailed It.
And if you're not familiar, it's an amazing show on Netflix of trying to do like Instagram style baking and failing spectacularly and buying
It's so good. I love it. It's so good.
It makes me so happy because I've been that person. I've totally been like Instagram and be like, I can learn how to use fondant today, no problem. And then I'm like, oh man, these cakes look horrible.
Yeah, I love it. It's like the classic, like, oh, I saw this thing on Pinterest, and so I'm gonna, try to do it.
Yes.
And the hostess, I think her name is Nicole Byers, if I'm not mistaken.
I think so.
Is that
yes.
her name? She's so funny. I love her.
She's so cool.
Nailed it so good. Also, congratulations on Breakout 3, by the way.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it happened. Totally, it was great.
I heard so much great stuff about it. I'm definitely gonna get out there next year.
You should and be one of our guests and talk on panels. Pressure.
Yeah. I love going to conventions and talking on panels. It's my favorite thing to do.
Cool.
I'm allowed to do it so often. We better wrap it up.
Well, thank you so much for joining me for another GN Masterclass, Jason.
Oh, you're welcome, Kate Bullock. Thank you for inviting me.
Cool. You can find me at bluestockings.ca. And Jason, do you want to tell all these fine people where they can find the gauntlet?
Hey, go to Twitter at Gauntlet RPG. It is the community Twitter and my personal Twitter, so you get both in one. That's a great place to go. We're on G+. Just go to the community section of G+, and search for the Gauntlet. You will find us there. We have a website. It's gauntlet-rpg.com. And we are on Patreon at patreon.com/gauntlet.
Amazing. Well, thank you all for joining us for this fantastic, snotty episode of GM Masterclass. And we hope you have a great week.